I will talk more about ideas and concepts and frameworks for understanding art and architecture, less about the art and architecture themselves. I don't want to give you a lecture like I do to my students, one building after another, saying what they mean and what they are. I want to talk about ideas. So to talk about ideas, I start with this image. This is a piece by one of my favorite contemporary artists in Brazil, Laís Mija. She did this installation at the São Paulo Biennale, the last one in 2016. You can see that it's in the most important space, the atrium of the Oscar Niemeyer building, the Biennale Pavilion from 1954. And the installation is called Double Standards. Dois pesos, duas medidas in Portuguese. And it's double standards because it's a really powerful critique of modernization. On one tower, you have the modern tower. It's brick, concrete, steel. The other tower is the other, right? It's the natural materials. She's, of course, referring here to the architecture of the native Brazilians on thatch, wood, and adobe, clay that is not fired. But it could be reference to any other. It could also be a reference of two very powerful concepts that are constantly used to label all of us. One is the concept of knowledge, and the other is the concept of culture. Hold on to the idea of knowledge versus culture, because I will go back to it. I don't want to spoil it. Go really fast. There was an elevator seater there that will come back later. This is an image called The Tree of Architecture. This is published by Bannister Fletcher, father and son, two historians, British historians. And this is the very end of the 19th century. So England, at the height of its power, controlling the oceans all over the world, publishes this tree of architecture. You have the affiliated disciplines here, climate, geography, sociology, history, etc. Then you have the trunk. And what is interesting to me is to see what they choose to be in the trunk and what they choose to be in the branches, right? So the trunk is the construction of the so-called Western culture. The trunk is Greece, Rome, Middle Ages, Renaissance, and then what they call Americas here is only Chicago. It's only the skyscraper architecture of the 19th century, late 19th century. And it's very important to understand this construction, right? It's not everything from Greece that is selected to be part of Western culture. There's a lot of Greece that I see here in Moscow. The characters, the Orthodox religion, there's a lot of Greek tradition that came northeast of Greece. That is not part of this trunk. This is a very peripheral branch, right? The same that Spain or Eastern Europe or Latin America or Asia and Africa are completely absent here. Those are very far away branches. So it bothers me how this is constructed and how we take it for granted. We don't always question that construction. And the fact that we should be constructing other narratives, that's what this show does. That is so interesting to me, that this show is constructing another narrative. It's putting other relationships on the map, relationships that have not been part of the Western culture as we know it. Now, it gets much worse than that. It gets much, much worse than that. This is a map that I created about 15 years ago. I took 4 major books of modern architecture in English. Kenneth Frampton, Vincent Scully, William Curtis. And then later in 2012, I added Jean-Louis Cohen, another major book that talks about the architecture of the entire 20th century. And then I put a little dot in the map for every building mentioned. And this map is very explicit. I mean, I call it pornographic. It's not explicit, it's pornographic, right? The South doesn't exist. And this is not the equator. This is the Tropic of Cancer. This is 22 degrees north. The South doesn't exist. Western United States and Canada doesn't exist. Mexico doesn't exist. And here, look at this line, right? You know this line very well. This is what happened after World War II. So how do you name this? I mean, when I teach, when I write, I do a very strong critique of Eurocentrism. Now, I am in Europe right now. This is part of Europe, but it's not part of NATO. This is NATO-centrism. This is a term that Russian scholars use to talk about the military alliance that dominates the world military, but also the world finances and the world globalization, trade, etc. And I borrowed that term to apply to architecture. And it's not a coincidence, right? This is the North Atlantic. And the military alliance that controls the planet since the end of World War II, it's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So this is NATO-centrism at its highest. But we don't see it. We don't talk about it that way. Hundreds of thousands of architectural students all over the world, right? All Japanese students, all Korean students, all Indian students, all African students, all Latin American students, Mexico students, they all learn in architecture books that make direct reference to this. As a consequence, all of those architects, all of those students, I mean, the numbers are, we have today about 1.5 million to 2 million architects in the planet, about 2 million students in the planet. Every single one of them, from Mozambique, from Bolivia, from the Philippines, from Indonesia, they all know their local architecture and the architecture of NATO. They know New York, they know Chicago, they know Paris, they know Amsterdam, they know London. And it's a gigantic distortion, especially when you think about the 20th century. 20th century avant-garde, come on. Moscow, Kiev, or Prague, Budapest, they were way more important than London in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, at least in architecture. But that's not how we teach. We teach this way. We teach on this distortion. Mexico City is more important than any other city in North America. And yes, Mexico City is in North America in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Rio is very important. Buenos Aires is very important. But this is not how we teach. So I welcome the idea of this show. I celebrate the idea of this show because we are building other connections in order to challenge the NATO-centrism of the 20th century. Now, that's the main reason for writing this book. I wrote the book with a friend from Mexico, Luis Carranza. For about 10 years, I met Carranza in 1997, 20 years ago. And for about 10 years, we would meet every year. You know how scholars are. We have conferences and seminars, etc. We end up meeting because in the United States, there's a handful of us who are the leaders of Latin American architecture. And then in Latin America, there's another 50 people who are scholars in the field. And then we meet in Mexico City, we meet in Sao Paulo, we meet in Chicago, we meet in San Francisco, we meet all over the place. And we always had to tell the story from the beginning. We always had to start from the very beginning. like seeing things like in Latin America, things were different. The materiality is different. The economy is different. The way society is structured is slightly different. I mean, we had to start from the beginning, so the conversation never evolved. It never moved on, because we would present a very specific paper on a very specific moment of Latin American architecture, and the audience would make a very basic question that forced us to go back to the 1920s and explain again the Semana de Arte Moderna in Brazil, or Juan O'Gorman in Mexico, etc., and go back to the beginning. So for 10 years, we complained about that, and for 10 years, we expected somebody more senior to write this book. You know, there are people more senior, there are people 10, 20 years ahead of us in the field, and expected them to write the book, but they never did. So in 2010, we left another very frustrating conference session. We went to a bar in New Orleans to have a beer and debrief about the sadness of our field. And then we decided, you know what, Luis, we have to do the book ourselves. Nobody's going to do it. Now, I was 40 years old in 2010. Carranza is 2 years older, so he was 42. Said, you know, we have to do it, so let's do it. Now, how to do it? We decided that we're going to do the book, how to do it. In the United States, we have a process of becoming a professor that it's called the tenure process. I don't know if you are familiar with it. Once you have a job, it's called tenure track. For the first 6 or 7 years, you don't have a permanent contract. You have a contract for those 6 years. And after those 6 years, you're going to be evaluated by your seniors, and they give you a permanent contract, stability on the job, or not. And if they don't give you the tenure, you have to start again in another university. Harvard, for instance, doesn't give tenure to anybody, period. It's a given, everybody knows. If you go teach at Harvard, you either are very, very famous and they hire you already as a full professor, or you're going to work there for 6 years, will become famous, and then you go teach somewhere else. That's how they operate. But we both wanted to have this tenure thing, and we needed to publish. So the first time we tried to publish, normally people take their PhD dissertation and try to turn it into a book. So both of us did that, and it's a painful process. You work on your manuscript, you send to the press, they take 6 months to answer. When they answer, they say, oh, it's very interesting, we love it, but we can't publish it. Or we are booked for the next 4 or 5 years, and you don't have 5 years to wait. You're going to be evaluated in 3 years. So it's a painful process. And also, because of budgets, they cut everything you propose. You propose a beautiful book of 300 pages with 100 illustrations. They give you 180 pages, black and white, 10 illustrations. So it's like it is. The editorial process is brutal. So we decided, let's propose the best book ever, the biggest. Let's propose to cover the entire century, the entire Latin America. Let's say we're going to write 150,000 words, which is over 700 pages. Let's say we're going to have 300 illustrations, because they will cut. And after they cut, we do a really good book. So we sent the proposal to the first editor, the University of Texas Press. It's not because I teach there, but they are the best press in Latin American studies in the United States. We have the best library of Latin American studies. We have 230 Latin Americanists in the faculty. But we sent it to an editor there, and usually the editors take, I'm trying to publish a book right now. I have a manuscript ready, and the editors respond 3 weeks later, a month later, 2 months later, etc. It still happens. I did not become famous. I'm still in the hard process. But for this book, the editor answered the next day. We sent a proposal, email, and a PDF. We wrote only 2 chapters. The book has 106 chapters. Just to give a sample, we asked for the 300 illustrations. We said the book would be that big. The editor answered the next day saying, yes, I'm waiting for this book for a while. Please do it. And they accepted everything we proposed. And now we are in trouble. Now we have to write this gigantic book and never try to do a book with 300 illustrations. That's 300 permissions. You know, about half the illustrations are ours, the drawings are ours, etc. But it's still 150 permissions. There's 150 letters that you have to write to the families of the architects saying, please, can I use the drawing of your grandfather, etc., etc. Many of them wanted to charge. Many of them never replied, etc. But we did the book. We are very happy that we did the book. After that, I learned my lesson. I became an editor. The lesson that I learned with the book is what Ricardo Piglia, Latin American fiction writer from the 20th century, he wrote that. I've read it, but I never experienced it. The fact that books don't travel. We travel. I go in a bunch of places to talk about this, talk about Latin American architecture, but the books don't. They are heavy and expensive. You know, it's very expensive to send those books anywhere. I sent a book to a professor in Argentina. The book cost $35 at Amazon.com. I sent one to a professor in Argentina that is one of my mentors, somebody that helped me a lot, that I really respect. It cost $40 just to send the book by mail to Argentina. So it's more than the cost of the book itself. Books don't distribute. Our distribution process is awful. So I learned that, and I created an editorial house of ebooks that distribute content. This is my best book so far that I edited, the book of the Arquitetos Associados. At the very end, I will talk about them and why they are so important. But we do ebooks, and we also do print because we love the books on paper, etc. But because books are difficult to distribute, we do a lot of ebooks in order to have this dialogue. And all those books are bilingual. This one is trilingual. This one is Portuguese, Spanish, and English. And all the other ones are Portuguese and English. But together with the book, we wanted the book to be a map of 20th century architecture in Latin America. And we talked about it in the introduction of the book. What is a map? The Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges has a beautiful story about maps. He said that there was a society once somewhere that was so enchanted with the idea of maps that they created a map on a one-to-one scale. They created a map on real size, and they wanted to register everything on real size until they discovered that one-to-one scale is useless. There's no use for a map on real scale. It's a reproduction of reality. You don't use it like that. Maps are supposed to be simplifications. They're supposed to be reductions. You're supposed to edit the information to only the information you need so you can help you navigate and have your own experiences. You don't need every detail there. So the book is understood as a map, was proposed as a map, so that everybody can go and navigate. This is the 28th time that I talk about the book, 28th city. And in every city, there's always somebody, I'm waiting for the one in Moscow, that will ask me, why you didn't include such and such in your book? I mean, because I can't include everybody. I can't include all the buildings. It's impossible. But after the book was done, we did this exhibition that is a long timeline. I love the timeline that you have back there, explaining Eastern Europe and Latin America. I think those things are very important. In our timeline, the buildings are the focus. I mean, you have a little bit of socioeconomic information, and here architecture information to locate the buildings. But what we want to see is the relationships between them. This one is in Brazil, this one is in Argentina. What are their relationships? This one is in Peru. How do they come together? It's this cross-fertilization that we are proposing as a way to understand things. It's the same way as the art show. There are art pieces side by side. The artists themselves, maybe they never knew of each other, maybe they never saw each other work, but the work creates a dialogue, and the dialogue helps us understand what's going on in that zeitgeist. So the exhibition has traveled also extensively, 25 places. And after that, after the book, after the exhibition, from the experience of traveling to those 28 cities, 5 of them in Europe, 23 of them in the Americas, I developed a new research project, a new endeavor, very ambitious, quite ambitious. I want to think about the space of the Americas. I want to try to understand the space of the Americas, because we have a problem in architecture, landscape, planning, urban design. We believe that space is a fundamental component of our experience. We believe that space not only matters, space is the core of what we do. Nonetheless, all our theories come from Europe. So wait, there's something here that doesn't match. If space is so important, why do we import all the theories from Europe? The easy answer is that most of us, the large majority of us, are dislocated Europeans. I mean, look at me, I look European. My Spanish family from 300 years ago look European. When I am in Spain, they can't understand my accent. They ask if I'm Russian. They asked me many, many times in Spain if I'm Russian. But then I go to Italy, they think I'm Spanish. I go to Germany, they think I'm French. But, you know, it's many of us Latin Americans are like that. Many of us Americans, of all the Americans, are like that. So the idea here is to systematize a number of thinkers, scholars, who wrote about space in the Americas. And from them, try to understand what is a space of the Americas. So I go back to double standards. I go back to double standards because here I can explain now what I'm talking about, culture and knowledge. There is a big inequality in the way we deal with information, right? If something comes from Germany or Japan or the United States, it's knowledge, right? It's supposed, I mean, you don't, it's harder for us to doubt it. You know, if the information is coming from Cambridge, the information is coming from the University of Munich, Technical University of Munich, if it's coming from Japan, it's coming from MIT in Boston, we don't doubt it. We accept it as knowledge. But if the information comes from Morocco or comes from Vietnam or comes from Peru, then we say, well, it's part of that culture. This way of doing things, this way of understanding the world is part of their culture. So please, let's get rid of that. Please, let's understand that everybody has knowledge, everybody has culture. The way that everybody has an accent, everybody has an ideology. The problem is, with accents and ideology, you only see the others. You don't see your own. It's hard to understand your own accent. It's hard to understand your own ideology. It's easy to see the other's ideology or the other's accent. The same with culture. Everybody has a culture. Everybody has a context of ideas and values in which they are immersed. And everybody has knowledge. The most uh, non-productive hunter-gathered in the, what's the name of the, there are some islands close to Australia where there are societies that they don't even have agriculture. They don't even domesticate any plants. So the people who still live the closest to very ancient societies, they do have knowledge. It's not only MIT and Cambridge and Oxford that have knowledge. So I will talk about 3 of those authors only before I go talk more about architecture and art. Viveiros de Castro is the first one. He's a Brazilian anthropologist. He's still alive. And he has a very important theory that, like any theory, is being tested nowadays. It's being tested by many other anthropologists all over the Americas. The theory of Viveiros de Castro is that because of 15,000 or more years of isolation, the societies of the Americas developed an ontology, developed a system of beliefs and knowledge that have a lot in common. Go back to why I'm talking about those 15,000 years or more. The Americas were probably the last part of the planet to be dominated by Homo sapiens, by us. We know for sure that a significant group of Homo sapiens went to the Americas by walking across Siberia here and then crossing the Bering Strait and going down to Alaska and Canada and then populating all of the Americas. That we have a lot of evidence for sure. There are problems with that theory. For instance, what allowed the Bering Strait to be walkable? So anthropologists, the old ways, they think that those primitive people didn't have the power to have navigation. They have no canoes, for instance, so they can only walk. So they walked the Bering Strait in the last glacier era when the planet was so cold that the level of the oceans dropped. So it was easier for them to walk the Bering Strait and go from Siberia to Alaska. Problem is, the same code that drops the ocean level also drops a blanket of ice on top of Canada, 1.5 kilometers deep. That's 1,500 meters deep sheet of ice on top of Canada. So, okay, they are very primitive that they can only walk the Bering Strait. How come they walk the next 3,000 kilometers over 1,000 meters of ice, 1 kilometer of ice? You know, there's a lot of flaws in that theory. But they did. And they also did use canoes. We know that more and more now. It's being debated, it's being discussed, but we know that they use canoes. We know that there are human bones, Homo sapiens bones, in the San Diego, Tijuana area, in the northeast of Brazil, and in Chile, a place called Monteverde, which are older than 15,000 years by carbon dating. So they got there before a few human beings. We don't know how. The main theory now is that people did have the ability to use canoes and navigate, the same way they got to Australia, the same way that people went to Australia before that. They probably also was able to cross the Pacific and go to the Americas. It doesn't matter. There was 5,000 years at least of isolation, some contact through the Vikings, also here from the Baltic, from Norway and Sweden, to Greenland and to the north of Canada, maybe some other contact by canoe, but not much, in a way that cultures developed there in isolation, isolated from the other 3 big pieces of land, 2 big pieces of land, Eurasia and Africa. In that isolation, they developed something that Viveiros de Castro called Amerindian perspectivism. What is Amerindian perspectivism? It's a way of relating the human to everything else in the world that is very different from the Western way. The Western way, let's use René Descartes, 17th century Dutch philosopher. What Descartes says in Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, is that we have this ability to think nothing else has. No other animal, no other living creature have an ability to think. So it's a huge separation between us and everything else. And modernity is based on that separation. Now, for the Amerindians, there is no separation. Everything has human potential. So if you have a little pebble, little rock on the bottom of a river, it has no humanity. It's just a pebble. But if you take that pebble, clean it, polish it, and hang it on your neck, the pebble gains humanity, and you gains pebbleness. You become a pebble. Now, if you work on wood, you become wood. If you work with fish bones, you become fish bones. Think of it for what we eat, the biological, chemical process of eating. We become fish. I ate duck today for lunch. I become duck. What was once a bird is now part of me. And the duck became me. So there's a lot, especially in times of climate change, in times of radical need to rethink our relationship with nature. The Amerindian perspectivism has a huge contribution. And it's completely different from the Western European modern way of relating to nature. So this is one of them, and it has tremendous implications from how we deal with space. Space, from the Amerindian perspectivism framework, is something alive. Everything in space can become a little bit more human or a little less human. Oh, and by the way, in all the Amerindian societies, there is no death penalty. There are no prisons. None of those societies developed prisons. The penalty for doing something wrong is exile. You did something wrong, you killed, you hurt somebody, you go live by yourself outside of the group, which means you become less human. You lose your humanity by being in isolation and not being close to other humans. This is Murakitan. This is an Amazonian lucky charm. It's amuleto that the Amazonian societies do with pebbles, with rocks, and they use it hanging on their necks. The next one is Edmundo O'Gorman, Mexican historian, already died in the 1990s. In the social sciences in the United States, we use a lot of Edward Said. I don't know if you guys have heard of Edward Said, the whole idea of Orientalism, how Europe invented the Orient, invented the order in order to define itself. Edmundo O'Gorman wrote basically the same thing 30 years before. But O'Gorman wrote in 1947 in Mexico City. Edward Said wrote in 1978 in New York, in English. So the dissemination of Said made him a classic, and only few Latin Americanists know about Edmundo O'Gorman. But O'Gorman has a very central thesis to understand the Americas. The thesis is, in history, the order of the factors matter. It's not like multiplication. 4 times 6 is the same as 6 times 4. No, the order of the factors matter. And the order of the factors that we, all of us in the Americas, including my children, the next generation, learn history is with the altered order of factor. What did we learn in history? we learn that Europe over here was modernizing, was coming out of the Middle Ages, was becoming capitalist and modern and individualist, etc., etc. And because of that, it started navigating. It started the navigations. I mean, come on, there were always navigations. The Mediterranean has navigations for thousands of years, right? The Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, all of those were navigated for thousands of years. They started navigating further. But that's the way that history is taught to us, that because of modernization, Portuguese and Spanish started navigating and somehow landed here in the Caribbean. Well, what O'Gorman shows is that the order of this is very different. Let's see how he shows that. Using maps. He uses cartography to show that. So this is the world as understood by Europeans in the so-called Middle Ages, the 8th century after Jesus Christ. The world for the Europeans have three major land masses, Europe, Asia, and Africa, which is itself not true. The border here between Europe and Asia is arbitrary. You could put the border anywhere, right? What's the major geography that defines the separation between Europe and Asia? And you guys, Russians, know that very well. Here, Africa, yes, there's enough water surrounding the landmass that you can separate that continent. But this is very arbitrary. And the way they saw the world had Jerusalem in the middle, of course, the city that is the seat of the three major monotheist religions, and is surrounded by water. All around is water. So this has tremendous implications in worldview, in belief, in structure of society, etc. Now, when they develop better navigation tools, let's say 14th century, the year 1300, they started being more precise where they navigated. So the Mediterranean here is quite precise. The Black Sea, I believe, or the Black Sea should be this one, then the Caspian is completely not precise at all. When you go south in Africa, they know nothing. When they go to India or Southeast Asia or the East here, nothing. It's completely unprecise. But it shows that Europe is very peripheral. The center of the world is still here. The center of the world in the 14th century is Constantinople. And that's another major component of the so-called Western civilization. The complete ignorance of the fact that the Roman Empire did not finish in the 5th century. The Roman Empire moved, didn't finish. It moved and it continued in Constantinople until 1545. Is that correct? Is that the year that the Turks take Constantinople and name it Istanbul? So there's a lot missing on the way we learn history over here. There's a lot deliberately missing. It's missing on purpose. Now, what happened in the end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century? The navigations landed them here. The ships landed them here. At first, they thought they were in India. We still call the native inhabitants of the Americans Indians to this day, 526 years later. They thought they were in India. It took them about 10 years to understand, this is not India. This is not part of China. This is a completely separate landmass with completely different societies. When they learned that, around 1502, according to many historians, they had to rethink everything they thought they knew about themselves. That's the trigger of modernity. O'Gorman, in 1947, uses a powerful metaphor. This is way before the Sputnik, the first satellite put on orbit, or way before the landing in the moon. O'Gorman writes, if we someday find life in another planet, that will happen to us. If we find life tomorrow in another planet, we're going to have to rethink a lot of our most deep beliefs. That's what happened to Western Europe in the early 16th century. And that's the trigger of modernity. Everything that came later is a consequence of that, including, and very important, the Protestant Revolution. The first split of Christianity happened when Constantine moved the Roman Empire to Constantinople and adopted Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire. The second bleed split happened when Calvino and Lutero did their thesis and split Protestant Europe from Catholic Europe. And that, of course, has tremendous implications for the history of the Americas. But it was triggered by the encounter with the Americas. And again, space has a lot to do with it. How is this space organized is a consequence of those events. Yes, I wanted to put Alberti here. In architecture, Leon Battista Alberti is a very important paradigm shift. Before Alberti, the idea of architecture was trying to build the best possible looking at the past. The architects before Alberti were all looking at the ancient, and very much like the German Romanticism of the 18th century or the British in the 19th century, they were handpicking which past they want, but they were looking at the past. After Alberti, they start looking at the future. It doesn't matter how you built before. It matters how we should build in the future. In the Latin languages, the word for design, and I have no idea what the word for design is in Russia. I would love to learn, so you can tell me later. But in the Latin language, the word for design is progetto, progettare, proiecto, which means the same as projectile. So it's something that you throw, something that you project, something that you throw into the future. Now, Alberti published in 1481, a few years before Columbus arrived in the Caribbean. But he didn't become hegemonic until the Spanish had to deal with that gigantic territory. The Spanish suddenly had this humongous territory from California to Chile. And the Portuguese also, the relationship between the size of Portugal and the size of Brazil is even bigger than the relationship between the size of Spain and the size of the Spanish territory. When they had to do that, they took Alberti. They took Alberti's idea of geometry, they took Alberti's idea of projecting towards the future, and most important, they took Alberti's idea that if you build something, you're gonna form a society that way. So if you build a constructivist building, you're gonna have a constructivist society. If you build a fascist building, you're gonna have a fascist society. If you build a city for control and exclusion of the Native Americans, you're gonna have a society of control and exclusion, of violence and exclusion. So that comes from Alberti and is another major consequence of that paradigm shift of the early 16th century. Now, after Alberti, we have the third scholar that I will mention today, and then I promise to stop bothering you with those concepts and ideas and go back talking about beautiful things. Arturo Escobar is from Colombia. You notice that on purpose here I have one Mexican, one Brazilian, one Colombian. Arturo Escobar is from Colombia. He's still alive. His major publication is Encountering Development from 1995. And what Escobar articulates in that book is that there is no modernization without colonization. And what is colonization? Is the idea that the values and ways of being, the ways of operating of one group are worth more than the values and ways of operating of another group. Therefore, the group of colonizers have the right to impose their modes on another group. In the Americas, this is very important because after the encounter, after the Europeans arrived in the Caribbean in the late 15th century, very early 16th century, we had something that is still not discussed. It barely have a name. I will say the name, and I doubt that most people have heard about it. Have you heard about the Amerindian Holocaust? Has anybody encountered this expression? We know about other Holocausts of our history. The most famous of one, the Jewish Holocaust of World War II, of Nazi Germany. But the Amerindian Holocaust is much worse, much worse. Population of the Americas is estimated in 25 million people, at least in the year 1500, right after the Europeans arrived. And this estimation keeps growing because we keep finding bigger and bigger cities in the Amazon, in the south of Mexico, in the Mississippi Valley, in Patagonia, Argentina. We keep finding bigger and bigger cities. So the number keeps growing. There's been 10 years since I've been studying this, and the number is growing. But let's say 25 million, which is a very conservative estimate of population for the Americas in the year 1500. 100 years later, the population was 3 million. 3, from 25 to 3. 90% of population decline. Our species, Homo sapiens, have never experienced that in its history. Never. A population decline of a whole continent of 90% is unheard of. And why? Why did they die? Well, a lot from gunpowder and shots, but the large majority of it from viruses and bacteria, from smallpox, chickenpox, flu, the yellow fever that didn't exist in the Americas, many of those bacteria. Now, the big question is, why the Amerindians died from bacteria that came from Europe, and the Europeans didn't die from bacteria that came from the Americas? Why you don't have similar numbers in Sevilla, in Lisbon, in Genova, in Venice, right? The answer is very spatial and architectural because of density. The Europeans had densified before, and when they densified, they had their fair number of plagues, right? All the plagues of the 12th century, 13th century that killed half the population, a third of the population. The problem when those plagues came to the Americas is that it came under a process of colonization that made it much worse to defend. And then the result is the death of 90% of the population. And then this, what happens next after 90% of the population died? Well, they got another 10 million Africans, and they moved the Africans to the Americas to substitute the ones who had died, the peasants, the workers, the ones who did everything. So in the Americas, we are still very much, I don't want to use the word stained, but there's no better word. We are stained, we are marked, we are built by those two major tragedies. The Amerindian Holocaust of the 16th century and the Atlantic slavery trade of the 17th, 18th, and way into the 19th century. Now, this is what Arturo Escobar tells us. This is what Arturo Escobar articulates so well. In the architecture field of scholarship, we are still very much enchanted with the idea of modernization. I mean, you talk about modernization for architects, and most architects will say, yeah, this is good. We want to modernize. We want to be modern. It has a positive spin, while colonization has a negative spin. Nobody wants to colonize. No. I'm not a colonizer. No. It's a bad word, colonialism. Now, when you put the two of them together, you understand that there are very different degrees and layers of colonialism. We understand, for instance, that modernization happened for very specific people. I mean, to support and rise very specific people, meaning white, heterosexual males. If you are not white, you are here. If you're not male, you are on the half of the population that have the double shift, the double workload. And if you're not heterosexual, you cannot participate on any kind of leadership. That's modernization. It's not only the colonialism of Africa versus Native America, etc. It's the colonial relationships in our daily lives. It's the colonial relationships that tells my nephew that I love, 9 years old, he never picks up his glass and moves it to the kitchen. He never washes one glass, and he's 9 years old. There's a colonialism embedded there that takes a while to superate, to overcome. So, but we will overcome, and we will overcome with the arts. So this is how we organize the book. The book has the subtitle, Art, Technology, and Utopia. First, I'll talk about utopia, and this is very important because the Soviet experience from 1917 to, depends when people learn about Stalin, right? But starting in 1917 and moving on the 20th century, the Soviet experience was a major part of that utopia. Many of the architects of Latin America were communists. Artists like Diego Rivera, architects like Juan O'Gorman, Oscar Niemeyer, many of them. So there is an important connection here between the history of Latin America and the history of Eastern Europe, marked by the Soviet Revolution of 1917. Now, technology, and talk about utopia, right? This is here in your show. This is Gyula Kościuszko, the hydrospatial city, and Kościuszko himself was born in Eastern Europe, went to Buenos Aires as a child, and then is an artist that developed those spatial concepts. This is Sergio Bernardes, an architect from Rio de Janeiro that had amazing avant-garde theoretical experimental work, and this is my favorite. This is the Valparaíso School of Architecture, a radical pedagogy in the port city of Valparaíso in Chile, which developed in some degree of isolation and created amazing experimentations that are borderline between architecture and installations. For the group of Valparaíso, they see architecture as an event. The envelope doesn't matter. They don't care if next year the students go there and take those parts and use the wood and the fabric in another building. It doesn't matter. What matters for them is the act of building and the act of inhabiting. They were in a Jesuit school, a Jesuit university. They don't like to talk about it, but there's a lot of Catholicism in the way they do things. For instance, when students finish building something, they would have a meal there. It's very much like a communion, right? They would have a table and they would bring food and they would share the food. They would celebrate the act of inhabiting this space, and then they would go. Next year, other students would come and would build something else on next to it and would, as I said, take components of it. Look at this work by this Polish architect. I don't have my notes in front of me. The PowerPoint have the notes, so I would remember the names. But his work is exhibited right here, Oster Hansen, Polish architect who was doing this in São Paulo, Brazil, as a way to publicize Polish industry and Polish initiatives in the 1950s. So they're doing very similar things in around the same time. Talk about technology, right? The idea of reinforced concrete. The Americas are pretty much split technology-wise between North America, who follows the construction technology of Northern Europe, which is the frame technique. The components of a building are framed and filled with panels like. It's the traditional wood frame construction. And the southern part of the Americas, that we mostly call Latin America, which have a Mediterranean construction technique of masonry, bricks and mortar and stone. So when the 20th century comes, the northern part of the Americas, which you notice that my map have the south pointing up, right? This is because of Joaquim Torres Garcia drawing of 1943, America Invertida. And we draw it that way to force you to rethink those relationships. So in the north part of the Americas here, the technology is steel. So that's why Mies van der Rohe, for instance, flourished there. Mies would have much more difficulty building in Brazil or in Mexico. Hannes Meyer went to Mexico and was not able to build anything after about 10 years in Mexico. Now, Le Corbusier, with his Mediterranean inspiration, did flourish all over the southern part of the Americas. So the technology has a lot to do with that. And then had other things like the hanging floors, which is a Latin American invention. It was first drawn by, what's his name, Argentinian architect, Amancio Williams. Amancio Williams here in the early 40s drew a skyscraper in which you have one column and then a big structure on the top and the floors are hanging. Why do hanging floors? Because steel cables can hold an entire floor and they are that big. So cables of 3 centimeters diameter, 4 centimeters, can hold entire floors. If you do that with concrete from below, you need a column that is 40 by 40. So 40 by 40, 50 by 50 occupies a lot of space and doesn't allow you to have the full flexibility on that space. So the idea of a hanging building was built in Mexico. The Celonesi building was built in Buenos Aires. The Banco de Londres was built in São Paulo, the MASP Museum. All of them have hanging floors. And all of them are following Amancio Williams' idea. So it's this technology development that is cross-fertilized between Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Colombia that we want to talk about. And here's Amancio Williams' own house. This is not hanging. This is a concrete arch supporting the house. This is Kubitschek's house, designed by Oscar Niemeyer. And this is Barragan, Luis Barragan's own house. And then about the art. And I will finish my presentation talking about the art of this period. Architects usually work very close to artists. They usually collaborate a lot. There were moments in the history of the 20th century where art was leading the way. For instance, the avant-garde architecture of Mexico in the 1920s is very much led by the muralist movement, by the paintings of Diego Rivera, Clemente, now I'm losing their names, Orozco and Clemente Orozco, and the third one, sorry, hard drive is full, so there's no space for more things. And other times, like in Brazil in the 1940s, it's the architects who are leading. It's Niemeyer and Lúcio Costa and Afonso Reide who are bringing Cândido Portinari, Sestiati, Atos Bulcão, other artists into their buildings. But we try to map here how the artistic components, this is the Valparaíso School, this is some of the contemporary work in the 21st century. In our timeline, we map how the artistic ideas evolve. And let's talk a little bit about this art and about the relationships between Eastern Europe and Latin America. This is a house in Montevideo, Uruguay, by Julio Villamaró. It's very much an out-of-Los kind of plan. Very influenced by out-of-Los. You have the Vienna-Montevideo connection here. Villamaró studied in Spain before the Spanish Civil War in the 1920s, in the early 1920s. So he probably got in contact with out-of-Los ideas in Spain, in Barcelona, in the early 1920s. This is the studios of Rivera and Frida Kahlo in Mexico City by Juan O'Gorman, another architect that was a communist his entire life and was looking to the Soviet constructivism and rationalism his entire life, especially in the part of his life that he was building. If you look at the announcement of the lecture in the website, the image is a mosaic by Juan O'Gorman, the library of the UNAM, the University in Mexico City. Juan O'Gorman built those buildings and dozens of schools in Mexico City in the early 30s, and then he abandoned architecture. According to his very deep Marxist, Leninist ideas, architecture was too bourgeois. It would never be revolutionary. So he lost the hope that all of them had, that through architecture you could build a new society. Now, I don't know if he learned about what was going on with Stalin. I don't know if he became disenchanted, but the fact is Juan O'Gorman in the late 1930s abandons architecture, says architecture is a bourgeois endeavor. I will only do art. He became a painter, and he painted the rest of his life, and he did that mosaic for the UNAM library building. And at the end of his life, he did two more buildings, a house for himself and the museum for his friend Diego Rivera, the Anahuacalli Museum. And this is one that I really want to introduce to you. The architect of this house, this is the first real modern house built in Brazil, 1928. So it's before Le Corbusier went to Brazil. It's right after the Semana de Arte Moderna. The man who built this is Grigory Warszawskyj, Jewish Ukrainian from Odessa. He left Odessa in the teens, 1917, and went to school in Italy. He graduated in 1921 in Milano and went to Brazil. And he married in a very wealthy Jewish family in Brazil, the Klabin family. And this is the house that he built for him and his wife, and he built another house to sell, and there was an exhibition there, etc., etc. This is part of this diaspora connection. There are few artists that did the other way, that came from Latin America to Eastern Europe. I mean, most of them went to Paris or to New York, but there are many, many, many who came from Eastern Europe to Latin America in the first half of the 20th century. This refers directly to the double standards that I'm talking about. You know, we, in the history of art and architecture, we over-celebrate the ones who went to New York, the ones who went to Chicago, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, etc., etc. In my field, the Bauhaus is still the paradigm in which almost all the schools of architecture in the world are based on the Bauhaus pedagogy. Now, ask any student that study architecture all over the world with the Bauhaus method if they know where a significant portion of the Bauhaus method came from. They don't know. They think it was all invented in Germany. They have no idea that the Futhemas here is the basis of a lot of that experimentation that Kandinsky and others brought to the Bauhaus in Weimar and then in Dessau. So this is the double standards that we refer to. Vasily Kandinsky, not Kandinsky, Grigori Warshawskyj, do you think he's celebrated in Brazil? I mean, people acknowledge that he was the first to do that, but the ones who are celebrated are the ones who are connected to Le Corbusier and who rewrote the whole history in the 1940s and 50s with the help of the MoMA. The MoMA, those things are really exciting and interesting. So when World War II was going on and the United States decided to enter World War II, you guys here were already fighting on the famous Russian front. When the United States decided to enter, Latin American countries were still on the fence, you know? I don't know if the British will win or the Germans, so let's keep talking to both and we'll see, right? So when the United States entered the war, they enter with a huge push to bring Latin America to their side. They knew there were a lot of Germans in Latin America negotiating, talking, selling Germany and Italy, right? Italy has a direct connection to Latin America. The first country who received the largest number of Italians in the 19th century was Argentina. The second one was Brazil. The third one is the United States. So Italy is there. I mean, I'm married to a descendant of Italians. So at that time, the United States invented something called good neighbor policy, invented by Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller, who happens to be on the government. He was also at the board of the MoMA. And the good neighbor policy sponsored a lot of initiatives. Walt Disney created characters that were Brazilian and Mexican. Orson Welles went to Brazil to do a movie. Carmen Miranda, the Brazilian singer, came to New York to bring her shows to New York City and later to Hollywood. And the MoMA put on a show of Brazilian modern architecture. The first time that Brazilian modern architecture was celebrated abroad was the MoMA show of 1943 called Brazil Builds. And in the Brazil Builds catalog, in the Brazil Builds narrative, Grigori Warshawskyj disappears. There is no Grigori Warshawskyj. There's a lot of Niemeyer, there's a lot of Lúcio Costa, there's a lot of Afonso Reide, etc., but no Warshawskyj. So the history is being rewritten all the time from the perspective of the ones who control the narrative, who happen to control the means of production, controls the money. And we need to talk about that. For instance, this is Tarsila do Amaral. Tarsila do Amaral is a Brazilian painter, very important Brazilian painter from the 1910s and 1920s. And she has a big show at the MoMA right now. I was there on Tuesday before coming here just to see her show. And the MoMA finally acknowledges this connection. I mean, this is a poster by Valentina Tuladina from 1928, right? And you see this here? See this part of the poster? That's the Tarsila do Amaral painting. So those connections are there. Those relationships are there. They were paying attention. Tarsila do Amaral was looking at what female painters, female artists were doing at the Soviet Union in the 1920s and relating to it and engaging it. There's more. There is this, which for me is a very important artist with a very important installation. Hélio Sica, you see some of his prints here on the show. Hélio Sica, in 1966, did a show in London called A Pureza é Mito. Purity is a myth. What is purity? In art history, in architectural history, there's a lot of this still. What is pure? What is pure Renaissance, pure Baroque, pure modern? Why is the Bauhaus pure modern and not Melikov? Why is Mies van der Rohe pure 20th century and not Gregório Warszawski or Sérgio Bernardes in Brazil or Amancio Williams in Argentina or Mario Pani in Mexico? Who defines what is pure? It's that construction of the canon, that construction of the narrative that says this is pure Greek, pure Roman, pure Renaissance, pure modern. Everything else is impure. Everything else is not pure. Oh, guess what? For biology purposes, for evolutionary purposes, I would rather be impure. I don't want to have the same genes from all my ancestors. It's a death sentence if you are pure, if you have the same genes. I want impurity. I want to be part Moorish from North Africa, part Spanish, and part Native American. It's my DNA. I don't know if you guys have already tested your DNA. Nowadays, it's very easy. You buy a kit, you spit on it, you send. They give you your genealogic movement. I am 40% North African, Moor, right? When they invaded Spain and stayed there for 900 years, that's part of me. The other 40% of my DNA is Spanish, so Goths, Visigoths, plus Romans who were in the Spanish Peninsula also for thousands of years, and 20% native Brazilian, 20% Native American. You guys should do it. It's really interesting. It destroys the idea of purity in a very interesting way. And some of what they were doing. This is Lygia Clark. You have an object here. One of her bichos, one of her animals is here on the show. And this is Hélio Sica. Down at the entrance, you have Soto, Jesus Soto Penetrable. And him and Sica were doing penetrables and wearables at the same time. So Sica is doing those pieces here to be worn by people. Now, when you talk about colonization and modernization, there's a story that I have to tell you. In the late 60s, Hélio Sica did a show at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio. A beautiful building by Afonso Reide, all exposed concrete, amazing building. For the opening of the show, he invited hundreds of people from Morro da Mangueira, the people from the favelas that were working with him on experimenting this, because he didn't want those things hanging on the museum. He wanted those things with people dancing, and then he would record and make movies, etc. He wanted the performance of it. So he invited, the artist himself, invited hundreds of people from Morro da Mangueira, a favela in Rio, where he was working, to attend the opening of his show. The museum closed the doors and left them out. The museum did not allow them to enter. So talk about colonization. If you have brown skin and you look poor, you shall not enter a museum. Not even invited by the artist on his opening night. So this is part of Latin America, I'm sorry. Actually part of the Americas. Same thing in the United States. Exactly the same thing. This is also Lygia Clark. This piece called Bats reminds me of many of the pieces that I see here. The Mira Chandel piece, some of the Francisco Infante pieces, the other one on the Russian part down there that is rotating from the roof, from the ceiling. What? Thank you. They are all working with line. Actually, they are all working in a way with Vasily Kandinsky systematizations of point, line, and plane to create art. I mean, this is Francisco Infante. You see what they are doing here. And I want to finish with an artist that is part of that group that I wanted to present to you and talk to you about, Lygia Pape. It's another Lygia. Lygia Clark is the one who did work very closely with L.H. Seeker and have a piece here. Lygia Pape is a little bit younger, but she was doing very similar things. This is Teteia. It's a play of words with the idea of the spider net, teia. And Teteia in Portuguese is something very sweet, very cute. So she's playing with that. And this piece is nowadays at Inhotim. And I will talk a little bit about Inhotim. This is another piece by Lygia Pape. This is a beautiful, beautiful installation piece. It's just a piece of cloth with openings, and the children are supposed to wear it and put their head through the opening. And then, of course, children can never stand still. So even if you tell them to stand still for a photograph, they will keep moving, and they will give all kinds of different forms and configurations, compositions to this white piece of cloth. She was an amazing, amazing artist. She died in 2005. And then I want to take you to Inhotim and finish here. I think I'm good on time to finish. Inhotim is a major park in Brazil, very close to my hometown of Belo Horizonte, where I live about half the year. And a billionaire created those pavilions in the middle of a beautiful park with lush gardens. And some pavilions are for many artists, like the Galeria da Mata. Some are dedicated, like this is only for Cildo Meirelles, this is only for Tunga. And here is the Cláudia Andujar Pavilion, and here is the Miguel Rio Branco Pavilion. And I think that somehow the synthesis of the Americas is right here in the dialogue between the two. The synthesis of all of these that I'm talking about, the Amerindian Holocaust, the modernization/colonization, the idea of the Americas as something that triggered modernity, all of those happen here between the two pavilions. And the architecture of those two pavilions is by this young group, Arquitetos Associados. And I'm not going to show you the architecture. I'm just going to show you the art of the two artists. This is Miguel Rio Branco, born in Spain, but went to Brazil as a child. He photographs Afro-Brazilian populations, especially in Bahia. the most Afro of all the cities in Brazil, Salvador de Bahia. And he, by photographing poverty, by photographing exclusion, he gives visibility to this major issue in Brazil. And this is Cláudia Andujar, born in Switzerland, also immigrated first to the United States during World War II, and then she took a job as a photographer in Brazil to photograph the Amazon for Lifetime, that publication magazine, etc., and she never left. She stayed in Brazil and she stayed in the Amazon, and she works with the Yanomami in the northern frontier of the Amazon between Brazil and Venezuela. So between Cláudia Andujar photographs of the Yanomami and Miguel Rio Branco photographs of Afro-Brazilian populations, in the tension between them, we explain the Americas, the Holocaust of that population, their almost absolute disappearance, and the exclusion and the suffering of that population. Thank you. That's what I want to say.
Если у кого-то есть вопросы, я готова передать микрофон.
If you have any questions, I'll give you a microphone.
Oh, thank you so much, so many thoughts. It's a very good observation from the very beginning. And we have so many questions about modernity. We still discuss in Russia, what's a modernity, where does it start, and where does it end? Does it really end? And what about architecture in Latin America? Well, does it really end? And what about postmodern and like modernity at nowadays?
No, that's a great question. So I used to teach modern architecture. I teach modern architecture in Latin America for almost 20 years now. So one of the few advantages of being old and getting old is that you're allowed to change over time. You're allowed to incorporate new things. So when I started teaching 20 years ago, I would use Habermas, Jürgen Habermas, specifically to address this question. Are we still living in modernity? Are we on post-modernity? So Habermas versus Lyotard and Habermas versus Derrida. So I started from that debate and that perspective. Nowadays, I am more interested in putting Arturo Escobar to answer Habermas. So to me nowadays, it doesn't matter if we are still in modernity or not. Now, this is my perspective. The large majority of my colleagues are still discussing if we are modern or postmodern or not. But on my perspective, it's more important to me to talk about the dark side of modernity, which we tend to avoid. So the dark side of modernity in Germany, the dark side of modernity in the Soviet Union, the dark side of modernity in the periphery of capitalism, in the periphery of the United States. This tension between the ideals of modernity, which are empowering, liberating, transformative, and the actual implementation of modernity, which is colonialism, this tension is very, very interesting to me. Because I think none of us escape from that anymore. There was a moment at the end of the 20th century, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that the NATO-centric countries, United States and Western Europe, thought that they had overcome those dark issues of modernization and that they would lead alone. Forget it. You know, they have to deal with Brexit. They have to deal with racial tensions in the United States. They have to deal with the fact that people can buy guns and go to schools and kill their colleagues, their teenagers. this is all significant parts of the dark side of modernity. And they have to deal with the fact that there is no space for white heterosexual men to rule alone. They have to share with other groups that are not men, not white, not hetero. So this, to me, is how I'm trying to look at architecture. For instance, ask questions like, what about the people who built this? We have those amazing buildings in Brazil, amazing. They are works of art in composition, in organization, in space. But what about the hundreds of people who put concrete on their backs and go up the ladder to create that concrete? This is what I like in artists like Laís Mirra or others that are doing this critique. I think art can do this critique better than architecture can. Architecture as a profession, it's very much bound by the fact that it's very expensive. It takes millions to build anything. So if you are an architect and you want to build, you have to be cozy to money and power. There's no other way. Unless you are doing experimentations like, there's also people doing that. There's Alborde in Ecuador. There are some collectives in Brazil. There's Rural Studio in Alabama, United States. There is Juan Garduño in Querétaro, Taller Activo. Those are architects who are building with very, very little economic means. But the profession at large is still working after the next dictator or the next billionaire in order to get the next commission. And that doesn't create good scholarship. That doesn't create a good thought. It creates beautiful buildings, but not thought.
Thank you so much. I have one more question. Did you visit the exhibition?
Yes.
Another one about Lifshitz, about
Yes.
radical critique.
I did, yes.
So I think it's
I
very
did.
related with your speech.
Why am I a modernist? Why am not a modernist? Yes, I did visit the exhibition. And I wish I could read Russian because I wanted to read what is written there. I just picked up few pieces of his critique of modernism.
I think in the essence it's very related with the Escobar ideas because it's very related with Marxism, materialism and stuff like that. So it's definitely have deeper roots.
I need that to be translated in the near future. Please do it. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Еще вопросы, может быть?
Thank you a lot for your lecture. I wanted to ask you about the cultus nubes in Venezuela. Like, were some architectures of Latin America, did he inspire them? Were they imitating any of his works, like maybe actually this building, maybe they wanted to create something that was pretty alike his works?
Can you tell me again which Venezuelan architect are you?
No. Alexander Calder, he created nubes in Venezuela.
No, Calder in Venezuela, he created one big piece for the auditorium of the university. Raul Villanueva is the architect who was in charge of the entire campus of the Universidad Central de Venezuela, and he invited Calder, and Calder spent some time there and did these acoustic panels to be on the ceiling of the auditorium. It's a very important building in the history of the 20th century, and that collaboration is seen as a very successful one. The commission of those panels to hang in the ceiling of the auditorium.
Наверное, последний вопрос.
Hello, thanks for the lecture. And the question is, you said that 20th century established this kind of colonial relationships between like metropolis and colonials. And what colonial architectures and artists should do to heal these like marks of post-colonial system and be free, because these kind of relations also like so you got the question.
No, yeah, great. It's a great question. So there are many layers of colonialism, right? Take the U.S. universities. United States have a really good system of universities. They have a great knowledge production institution that produces a lot of knowledge. But even that institution, when it goes to architecture, the major authors of the books are British. So there's the colonial heritage of valuing Cambridge and Oxford more than their own MIT, Harvard, and Columbia and Stanford is still there. And then after that layer, the next layer, the Brazilians would look to the United States and copy or imitate or overvalue what is done in the United States. And then the next layer, the Paraguayans look at Brazil. If you go to Asunción, Paraguay, there is graffiti on the walls written, "Fuera con los imperialistas brasileños." So Brazilian imperialists go home because Brazilian business come and buy with money the product and the labor force and the land of places like Paraguay or Bolivia or part of Peru. So the system have very, very, has many layers. I mean, you can be in a position of metropolis in relationship to somebody else, in a position of a colony in relationship to somebody else. Now, what can architecture and the arts do to improve that? I think we can expose the system. I think the scholarship, the arts do that very well. And in architecture, it's the job of us, the ones who write the books about architecture, to expose and show how the system operates and how unequal it is. And try to learn a few tricks. For instance, that dichotomy of knowledge and culture is really important. So next time you write something about, I don't know, about Siberia or about Azerbaijan, remember that they have culture that are different, but they also have knowledge. So remember how knowledge and culture are used to diminish one and overvalue the other. If all of us are aware of this, then we will have achieved a gigantic step forward. If all of us are aware that everybody has knowledge, everybody has culture. Because we tend, open any newspaper and you see knowledge being used to describe Germany, England, France, and the United States. And you see culture being used to describe everybody else. So being aware of that is already a great step.
Thank you very much for your lecture, and sorry for my childish question, but you always mentioned this theme of culture and knowledge and associating it with Latin America. Were there are there any architectures who use some native motifs of natives of Latin America in their works, or it's just modern art and modern architecture, kind of this?
I think Mexican architects did the best job of incorporating what we call pre-Columbian, before Columbus, ideas, motifs, geometries, forms into their architecture. Throughout the 19th century, all of the countries of the Americas created identities in order to overcome colonization. So the United States created one identity, Mexico created another, Brazil created another. Those identities are stitched together, they are put together by intellectuals and scholars and writers and artists. And they deal with different components. For instance, in Brazil, it's very present, the idea of anthropophagia, what we call cultural cannibalism. It's an idea articulated by Oswald de Andrade in 1928. According to Oswald de Andrade, and he's referring to the myth that the native Brazilians were cannibals, they were not. There is no trace of human flesh or human bones in the remains of their food. That was never found, not yet. But there is the myth that they were cannibals. And he used the idea of cannibalism to propose that Brazilians should digest any influence, so should look at the Russian avant-garde, at the French avant-garde, at the North American avant-garde, should digest it and eat and make their own. It's a concept. Now, you look at the art done by all those artists, and the native Brazilians are not there. They are little bits and pieces. You look at Tarsila do Amaral, for instance, whose work is so important, there is a MoMA show only for her. There is no native Brazilian in her paintings. There are some Afro-Brazilians in her paintings, because Afro-Brazilians are 50% of the population, and you could not paint a Brazilian city without... let's look at the image. So this is Tarsila do Amaral, right? Who is she painting? She's painting European immigrants, and there is two. There are two Afro-Brazilian people here in this image. All the others are European immigrants. That's not an accurate representation of the Brazilian population. Brazil is 50% black, 50% Afro, with tremendous degrees of miscegenation, right? But it's 50% black and 50% white, Southern European, right? Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, a little bit of Germany, a little bit of Japan. So when she is representing that, she is creating an idea of Brazilianness. There is no native Brazilian here, right? Zero. In her entire paintings, I've never seen her paint a native Brazilian. So Brazil did not do a good job in that regard. Mexico did. In Mexico, there was resistance. The elite, the Nahuatl elite, did not surrender to the Spanish the way that the history books describe. I mean, the way the history books describe is that the Spanish arrived there, 300 people, and they conquered a huge country of 10 million. No, there was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of battles for a century, right? But the result of those century of battles and the result of the presence of buildings, because the Spanish burned everything they could burn. Every book, every codice, every piece of clothing, every representation of Aztec gods, they burned everything. What survived were the buildings. And the buildings and the oral history was enough for the Mexicans of the 19th century to say, this is part of who we are. So in Mexico, you have a good presence of, it's interesting to think about the names of those countries. So Mexico is the name of the ruling elite before Columbus, the Mexica people, the Aztecs. They were Mexica, it's their ethnicity. There are many others. There are Maya in the south, there are other ethnicities in the north, etc. Colombia has the name of the Genovese guy, Columbus. Bolivia have the name of the independence hero, Simón Bolívar. Argentina have the name of silver that was found in Potosí, but was transported down the river, Rio de la Plata, to go to Spain. The United States doesn't have a name of a place. It's the name of an organization. It's the name of an institutional organization. And Brazil has the name of the wood that was cut. That was the first economic activity that the Portuguese did, that was to cut Brazil wood that had a red pigment and bring to Europe to make red fabric. So it has the name of deforestation. So the names tell a lot. But some countries did a much better job. In the last 20 years, countries like Ecuador and Bolivia has also done a great job of acknowledging their pre-Columbian heritage and bringing that to the forefront. If you look at Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, he never dresses in European clothes. He always dresses on a traditional suit of the Andes. Ecuador also is doing a great job of acknowledging things like legal rights of rivers. So Ecuador, the water is so important, the rivers are important, so there is a statute in Ecuador that gives legal rights to rivers. So rivers have the right to petition the judge, say, hey, you are dumping dirty things on me. So it's there, it's slowly evolving.
Thank you again.
Thank you.